The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, I'm Marc Lamont Hill. I am the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. I am a professor, a scholar, but most importantly, I'm a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books, I'm the person who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book, and I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. That's why I started Coffee and Books. It's a podcast all about books. Every episode, I sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, and important books. And sometimes I'll hang out with experts, fans, and other special guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. And this week, I am very excited to be joined by an eminent historian. She is the author of a new book. It's called Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. She's a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. Martha S. Jones, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
Martha, every week I sit down with guests with a cup of coffee, of course. This week I am drinking a cup of cafe au lait. I happen to feel very fancy today, and so I'm drinking. It's really just coffee with hot milk, but I feel really cool when I say cafe au lait. And because I know you spend a great deal of time in France, I thought that this would be my way of feeling more sophisticated. But as long as there's coffee in it, I'll be okay. Are you a coffee drinker?
I am a coffee drinker.
What do you drink?
I usually drink espresso with a touch of milk. We call it a noisette, if you must know. But
absolutely. No, I'll write that down. That'll be my next drink. I like to put on considerable airs around my coffee. I'm a coffee snob. You have written a book that is incredibly important, but also incredibly timely. Many Americans in August were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which for many people gave women the right to vote. Obviously, as you talk about in Vanguard, that's not the whole story. This is in many ways a story about white women getting the right to vote. Can you help me understand, why you chose this moment to do it?
Well, there's no secret that I write this book in part because this anniversary is on the horizon, and I need to be sure that Black women's voices, that their stories and their perspective on the 19th Amendment, which is not quite celebratory. I need to be sure that that is part of our conversation in this anniversary year. So the timing is not only apt, the timing is intentional.
It's good. I mean, I actually, and I'm glad you demystified that. Some authors come on and say, it's just a major coincidence that my book happened to come out on the 50th anniversary of this or the 100th anniversary of that. But you were very intentional about writing a book that would come out during this 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. For those readers out there and those audience members out there, can you talk about what the 19th Amendment was supposed to be and why it didn't do what it was supposed to for Black women?
Sure. The 19th Amendment, in short, prohibits governments from using sex as a criteria when meting out voting rights. So laws that had for a long time included the qualification of male or men are now unconstitutional. And the door is opened in a new way at the polls for American women. But there's nothing in the 19th Amendment that interferes with the ability and the history of how individual states had used subterfuge, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and more to keep Black men from the polls. Everyone knows when the 19th Amendment is ratified that now, particularly in the American South, Black women will also still be kept from the polls despite a federal amendment.
The other piece of your book that I think is really interesting is the moment in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. Again, it's seen as the starting point of women's rights, at least in the popular imagination. We're often taught that in 1848, these women met in New York, and some men, including Frederick Douglass and others, and they started a journey that took us to 1920, and then suddenly women are free. You've talked about a little bit about how 1920 didn't give Black women what they needed to gain the franchise. But what was 1848 about?
One of the things we know about that meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, is that there are no Black women present. There are no Black women who participate in that meeting. And so the question for a historian like me is, so where were Black women? And it's necessary to leave the scene of Seneca Falls and follow Black women where they actually were. And in my story, one of the places that they are in 1848 is in the AME Church in Philadelphia, which is holding its every 4-year general conference. And Black women show up there talking about their rights. They want rights in the church specifically. They want preaching licenses. They want the church's authorization and full sanction for Black women's religious work. And so it turns out that Black women aren't at Seneca Falls, if you will, because they're busy elsewhere and they're working on their rights in their own spaces. And this is a lesson, right, in my approach for me in how to approach writing Vanguard, which is to say, if I keep looking for Black women in women's conventions, if I keep looking for Black women in suffrage associations, yes, I will find some of them there. And of course, the great Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn had done that work many years ago. But if I was really looking for most Black women, if I was really looking for Black women organized by the hundreds and eventually by the thousands, I was going to have to leave those suffrage associations and I was going to have to look to where they were. And that includes, importantly, in Black Baptist and Methodist churches.
That's an important point that you're making that as an academic, we sometimes may take for granted, but for the listeners of the podcast, I think it's important to point out that sometimes the reason why these stories are whitewashed is not just because we ignore the Black people who were in that room. It's that we don't look in other rooms. We don't look for the places where we actually are. As a historian, when you decided to make this book, what was your journey to get there? Were you looking in the women's conventions in the largely white spaces first, and you couldn't find Black women, and you went on a journey, or did you trace it differently?
I did trace it differently. You know, sometimes a historian's work is a little bit of happenstance. And many years ago, I had a professor who sent me into a microfiche collection. Now, I'm afraid too many folks won't even know what microfiche was. It doesn't matter. The point is, long before we were clicking on the web, we used to go into the library and use these celluloid collections. And I found a woman named Mary Small, who in 1898 was referred to as the Reverend Mary Small. And I said, what on earth is that? Sometimes, you know, it's the inverse. She's the Mrs. Reverend, right, which indicates she's married to a minister. But it turns out, in her case, she actually was ordained to the ministry. And so I start with her. And that's another lesson in how to do this work, is that Black women do leave us a record. They leave the signs. They leave the crumbs. They, you know, church women write memoirs, right? They participate in conventions. They speak on the record. And all of that, we have to return to that and then see out of those sometimes very small pieces of evidence, we can build full stories. But the record is there for us to discover if we're really committed to finding it.
So one of the things that you find in the book that I found really interesting is you help us flesh out how Black women's politics and the Black women's sort of resistance has always been intersectional. You know, in the 20th century and the 21st century, it is sort of au courant to say, I do intersectional work. And people talk about intersectionality and race, class, gender, among other things being sort of these points of intersection with, you know, so that we don't just look at race, but we look at these other identity markers, the ways that people are subjected to double jeopardy, the way that people experience multiple forms of harm at the same time. But what's exciting about Vanguard is that you talk about this idea that Black women have been doing this long before it was the cool thing to do.
Well, I put it different. I'd say Black women made it the cool thing to do, if you will.
Right.
And part of my work is to recognize how centrally intersectionality and intersectional analysis figures in the 21st century, and then sort of pull the thread. Where does that begin? Where does that come from? And it turns out we can go back 200 years to Black women who are using the pen and the podium and the pulpit. And what are they saying? They are leveling a critique of American politics and the ways in which both racism and sexism distort American politics in their own lives, but more broadly. And they are, as I think I put it in the book, you know, they are the original anti-racist feminists. And for a very long time, they are alone, right? They are really solitary in working through, voicing, and holding up the nation really to that sort of ideal. In the 21st century, that might feel not only au courant, it might feel axiomatic, right? It just might sound like common sense. But for most of US history, that is not common sense at all. And Black women are the ones who bequeath that to us and then keep those values alive, if you will, keep them thriving until the rest of the country begins to catch up.
As white women are fighting for their rights to vote, the language of universality is used. I mean, they're saying women's rights. They're not saying white women's rights. But very clearly, there was a pushback from Black women who were very clear and articulate about the gap between what's being asked for and what the realities are on the ground. How were white women making sense of that? What were they saying back in these moments?
You know, one of the most provocative things somebody said to me when I was in the midst of writing this book is, well, you know, sure, racism is a problem for Black women, but that's not a woman's problem, right? That's a race problem. And that idea, which still exists today, is what informs a great deal of the 19th century. But it's more than that, right? It's not just a sort of analytic divide and folks can't think intersectionally, right, about Black women as whole entities that can't be divided between race and gender. It's also that for white women, the political consequences of embracing that vision, of working through that vision, is to risk, and I think likely to lead to the alienation, particularly of white Southern women, who by the end of the 19th century are understood, they and their husbands are understood to be sort of essential components of winning a federal amendment, a federal women's suffrage amendment. So it's not only conceptual, right? It's politics, right? And politics require, in the judgment of some white women, the distancing from, the jettisoning of, and the refusal to take on, for example, lynching. You know, Black women say lynching and voting, they're one and the same issue, because even if we have a federal amendment and voting rights on the books, if violence and terrorism are the order of the day, we can't vote. Right? These aren't things that you can pull apart. They're not separate issues at all. But the major women's suffrage associations really draw a color line, and it's one that regards questions of racism, violence, and much more. White supremacy is outside the purview of what women's suffrage politics is interested in and what it is attempting to remedy.
I think that's an interesting point because, there are moments where mainstream white liberal feminism has kind of said, hey, we're all in the same boat. And those moments of division are seen as the consequence of the state or the consequence of patriarchy, as opposed to, at moments at least, white women making very intentional decisions about representing their interests at the expense of Black women. And what we're talking about here is exactly that, right? There are moments where white women could have said, hey, sexual violence against Black women, exploitation of labor against Black women, lack of access to the vote for Black women is our issue. A few weeks ago on the podcast, we had Mickey Kendall, and she was talking about that with regard to the current moment. And many people have talked about that with regard to the 53% of white women who voted for Donald Trump. Again, closing ranks around their own interests and maybe even their own racial identity, as opposed to this other stuff. Are there any moments in history where we could look to and see pushback to that? Are there moments where in the women's suffrage movement, where white women said, hey, we need to stop and think about these interests of Black women?
I would say, of course, there are exceptional white women who break with this view. So that's important to say. But from the movement perspective, the answer is by and large no. The resetting of the relationships between Black and white women really won't come until well after the 19th Amendment has been ratified. I write about women like Mary McLeod Bethune, for example, Nannie Helen Burroughs, women who in the interwar years, between the First and Second World War, become part and drawn to a movement we term interracial cooperation. And this is a very different set of terms through which Black and white Americans, particularly Southerners, reconvene. Now, the premise being there's one table, everyone has a seat at the table, we are peers, we're equals. That's very different than the suffrage movement in the terms of the suffrage movement, where there always was hierarchy, and Black women really were always subject to this awkward and tragic negotiation with white supremacy. Interracial cooperation is a different kind of moment. And women from Mary McLeod Bethune to Nannie Helen Burroughs and more are, I think, struck and even moved by the experience of sitting at a table by terms that are very different than the terms that their foremothers had experienced.
There is a way that even fighting for the vote itself is a privilege. It's an exercise of privilege. I mean, and again, I don't mean to diminish the value of the vote, but there's a way that even fighting for the vote as your primary issue is its own kind of luxury when the state is actively trying to kill others. And you talk about this in the book, of course. How did Black women sort of prioritize and frame the vote in relation to other matters that Black folk and Black women in particular had to wrestle with at that moment?
So when we remember that, for example, in the 1890s, the end of the 19th century, where we situate the rise, the advent, the beginning of Jim Crow, Black women are there. Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and many others coming together in what ultimately is the National Association of Colored Women. Why don't those women simply join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is already rolling? Well, it's because they are going to, in my view, give equal concern to winning federal anti-lynching legislation. That is equal to Black women, to the quest for political power and the vote. So there is that, right? There are pressing concerns, and Black women do not become single issue. They don't see that as a way forward, and they don't organize their politics in that way. At the same time, Black women are looking to craft a way of working that keeps them working with Black men in civil rights organizations, inside churches. There is work to do. There is housekeeping and more, right, to do within Black-run organizations, within Black communities. And so Black women are attending to that simultaneously to attending to sort of politics external.
You talk about Black men, and because so far I've been talking a lot about white women and sort of their relationship to this, obviously because of it's a movement. But where are Black men in this story, right? Like, how are Black men responding to the call from Black women for greater levels of freedom, greater levels of access to the franchise, et cetera?
Well, like a lot of things, it depends, right? And the women I write about are very concerted in their efforts to win male allies in church, for example, but in anti-slavery work and much more, certainly in civil rights work. The women I write about understand the value and, frankly, the necessity. But it's deeper than that in a sense, because the women I write about are not looking for political power's sake, right? They're not looking to lift Black women up and above or distinct. And again in the story of Vanguard, we see the ways in which Black women's interest in political power is absolutely fused to the political interest of Black men. One example comes from 1913, 1914. There's a federal amendment on the table in the Senate that would provide for women's votes. What's the discussion in Congress? Well, some of it is about repealing the 15th Amendment in exchange for a women's suffrage amendment. Well, Black women have to attend to all of that, right? They don't have the luxury of saying, okay, let's horse trade and I'll take women's votes in exchange for giving up Black votes. And so the experience on the ground is also the ways in which men's and women's interests are much of the time, very much fused to one another.
Would it be too simplistic an analysis? I'm sure it's too simplistic an analysis, but tell me why it is. To say that Black women have been too generous and too intersectional and too committed to the rights of others at their own expense?
Well, I'll answer you this way. It is a distinct burden that Black women have borne, at least for 2 centuries, right, in the United States. It is a distinct burden to hold up a high bar, right, and say no racism, no sexism. And while there are allies in this story from time to time, that is a lonely and heavy burden to bear. I guess I don't quite think to brand that unfair is quite right. I'm enough of a historian to know that on many questions and in many epochs, there are those who bear the burden, right, of the righteous, of the just, right, of the visionary. And I call the women in my story the Vanguard because they are pointing us to a future that many Americans can't see. And if I could rewrite it, would I write it all differently? I can't. But I can recognize that Black women do something distinct and fundamental and absolutely necessary for this nation. We might say they continue to do that even in the 21st century.
They absolutely do. Let's talk a little bit about the 21st century. Some of the most prominent political figures we've seen. I mean, I'm thinking about Kamala Harris at the current moment. I'm thinking about the sort of grassroots energy around a Stacey Abrams. I'm thinking about the fact that a Black woman was almost certain, in many people's estimation, to be the vice presidential choice of Democratic nominee Joe Biden, speaks to a certain kind of shift in politics, or at least perception of the role of Black women in politics. How do we get there? Is this in some ways a culmination of this kind of struggle, or an outgrowth of that struggle, or a result of it, or a consequence of it? I mean, what's the relationship between the struggle we've seen for women's rights and what we're seeing right now today?
Yeah, there's no question. Those who heard Senator Harris at the Democratic convention and her acceptance speech, she name checks Mary McLeod Bethune, Mary Church Durrell, Ida B. Wells. There's no mystery about how someone like Senator Harris or Leader Abrams come to be who they are and where they are. They themselves tell us about the political tradition that has birthed them. And it is not Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan Anthony at all. In many cases, it are these Black foremothers, a Sojourner Truth, a Harriet Tubman. These are women that Stacey Abrams has spoken about again and again as informing and inspiring her, alongside a Shirley Chisholm and a Barbara Jordan. So Black women know their political history and where they come from. And I've written a book, frankly, to try and help other Americans understand the story that someone like Kamala Harris is telling when she begins to name the Black women, the foremothers, the sheroes, right, who undergird her political work. So for someone like me, immersed in this history, there's nothing surprising about 2020. Of course, there are surprises, but there's nothing surprising about the phenomena of 6 Black women on Joe Biden's long, short list. Not one,
Right.
because Black women have been prepared for this moment and to step into it for a very long time. That has been the work, certainly since 1965 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but even before. The Black women have been already. And the remarkable thing about 2020 is, yes, Senator Harris's nomination, but I think as important, it's the 130 Black women who are running for Congress and the hundreds more who are running in local and state level contests. You know, people have remarked about Senator Harris as a first. And I really think we need to move on from that sort of thin valorization. Black women are a force, and Senator Harris is one, right, of hundreds of Black women who are vying for political power, who are vying for public office. And if we set them alongside, as you say, right, the thousands, the tens, the hundreds of thousands of Black women who are doing the work of politics day in and day out at the grassroots, whether it's at the polls or in the church basement or in front of City Hall with a placard, we recognize that force. And the story I tell in Vanguard is aimed to try and help us appreciate how we got here.
Well, absolutely. And talk to me about being a historian writing for a bigger audience.
Mm.
You know, there's a way that anyone who is an academic and they decide to write for a bigger audience, they have to shift their language. We have to use different words. We have to tell our stories differently. But it seems to me that some of the most successful people in doing that have been historians, right? I'm an anthropologist by training. And I mean, for every, Margaret Mead who had books in the public sphere or Paul Farmer or whomever, there are lots, maybe hundreds of historians. You can win a Pulitzer Prize as a historian. You can be an academic as a historian and write your book on a commercial publishing house. What is it about historians and historical writing that seems to be easier for the public to get or connect with?
on good days,
If it is.
yeah, I think on good days we're storytellers, right? And the power. I mean, even anthropologists know about the power of narrative and storytelling. And so I think that this was a shift for me. I'm a legal cultural historian by training. I'm not a storyteller by training. And so I had to learn how to move away from my analytic writing, my writing that really was aimed at intervening in, very important but sometimes arcane scholarly debates, to lift up these women by way of their own stories. I'm aided by them because they themselves are storytellers, right? And so my archive is the memoir, it's the letters, it's the diary, it's Black women's own words. And so part of the strength.
And your own family, right? I mean, you start the book with family
and
narrative.
my own family. And so I think that among historians, there is an old and protracted debate about the value and the power and the subterfuge of narrative too, right? Narrative is a technique that covers up a whole lot that we don't know. And so that's important to say, that narrative isn't transparent or straightforward always.
Can we pause there for 1 second? Because that's an important point. I remember taking a graduate course, when I was I got a degree in Middle East Studies, and I was a graduate degree, and I was taking a course called Imperialism in the Modern Middle East. And he would start with the Ottoman era and take us up through World War II and take us up to the contemporary time. And he would he would literally sit there for hours and just tell stories and these narratives that you're talking about. And I was like, this man knows every single thing that's ever happened in the history of the Middle East. I mean, it was breathtaking. And one day I asked him, I said, how do you remember all that stuff? And he said, there's a way that, as a historian, he was being a bit overly self-deprecating. He said it's almost like a parlor trick. We know how to tell the story in a way that seems like we're telling the whole story. He said, there's lots of stuff I don't know. I'm just not mentioning the stuff that I don't know. And so as you write, do you ever worry about that this story is so compelling that there's so much that I'm leaving out, stuff that could be significant or that could twist the story in a way that leads to an outcome we don't want or an interpretation that we don't want?
Well, sure. And I think there is a line in Vanguard where I say, right, no book can tell all the stories, right? And so you have to confess that to your reader. And at the same time, your reader has to trust you enough that you, by your reputation, by your track record, by your deep knowledge, which is buried in the footnotes, your reader has to trust you enough that when you're choosing, you're doing so in a way that is true, small t, true to the historical record, that does a kind of justice to the infinite stories that we can tell. So I am mindful of that. I work in a community of Black women historians, and so I am accountable to them. I work in an office with my grandmother on the wall. I'm accountable. So I know who I'm accountable to, in addition to readers, right, is that there are folks who are going to read carefully and read critically, and there are folks who may disagree with the choices that I've made in Vanguard. I think there's a lot that is not in this book because the focus is on the vote. For example, it is not a book about Black radical politics. It is not a book about Black left politics. There's a nod to that. There is other important work that does that. And so it's not a book that can stand alone as the only thing we read about Black women in politics. I've taken up a slice of it, and I hope I've done justice to that slice. But it's always, on a shelf with the other books that we need to read in order to understand the bigger picture.
You say you're in community with other Black women historians. I mean, just in the last year or two, I mean, I've read books, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, Tanisha Ford, Tiffany Gill, Treva Lindsay. I mean, there have been so many interesting books that have come out from Black women historians. I think for many people, the idea of the historian is still an old white man in a tweed jacket, telling very particular stories about the American Revolution or about Lincoln or whatever thing the American Academy finds interesting. Is there more space for Black women historians now? What does it mean to be a Black woman historian now?
There absolutely is. And I think it's because Black women have made those spaces, so the Association of Black Women's Historians, which I give more than a nod to in the acknowledgments of this book, is the community out of which I write. And that organization is 3, maybe 4 generations now of Black women's historians. And that's one way to think about how deep and how rich our community is. But the other thing I think that this book helped me to rethink is that, in fact, the tradition is older than that. We didn't write conventional histories, but when Anna Julia Cooper writes her A Voice from the South. When Harriet Jacobs pens Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, this is part of where, in my view, Black women's history emerges from. And we don't emerge out of, German inflected seminar rooms. We emerge out of our real experiences and our real pens and our real paper and our real voices. And so, in addition to the scholarly community, I think many of us feel accountable to a long history of Black women's writing and that tradition. And that's what we grow out of, I think.
Who do you read?
I'm reading fiction, because one of the things this book taught me about was that I wanted to be a better writer, that I wanted to be a writer and not just a thinker and an analysis, and not just a middle of the road storyteller. And so I think there's no question but that beautiful fiction is a way to always be upping your game. I'm reading Britt Bennett's The Mothers right now, which I missed when it first came out. So I'm going backwards in her oeuvre and reading that. And that is important also for our craft. And I think that distinguishes sometimes historians from other social scientists, in that we're humanists, at least in part, and our fellow travelers are folks in literature and in the arts, as well as those in the social sciences. And so I read fiction when I can.
That's wonderful to hear. And that's been something that I have discovered more and more as I interview authors, is that some of the most fascinating and rigorous thinkers, whether it's in economics, whether it's in political science, whether it's law, they're reading fiction. And some of it is for craft, and some of it is just to escape. Some of it is to generate new types of ideas or new ways of analyzing an idea.
Well, and for example, I would make no claim to even approaching someone as extraordinary as Toni Morrison. Morrison runs through Vanguard, because Morrison gifted to so many of us the kind of the possibility and the insistence that when we write from the perspective of Black women, right? We stand in the shoes. We don't stray and imagine there's some objective or omniscient place from which we should write. We stand in those shoes. We resist the white gaze, and we work in that way. And so I think Morrison, for example, is a gift to all of us in Black studies, in any field, because of
every
that,
field, right?
In that sense. But then to go back and read Morrison, as I do also from time to time, is a reminder also that there's a craft and a beauty and an art there that talk about setting a high bar, but a wonderful one to just encounter again and again as we do what we do.
What's your writing process like? Would you write every day?
I write when I can. And this book I wrote with my students. This is something that's important to say. I was teaching. I was in a new job. I didn't have the opportunity to take a leave and secret myself off somewhere. So I wrote the first 2 rounds of this book in seminars with my undergraduate students, who were my best readers, true critics, generous, but direct, and they kept me writing and thinking and improving on what I was doing. And so that was new for me, but I recommend it for those who can figure out how to organize their writing in that way, because our students are great readers and they see things that we don't, because in some ways we're so inside the literature and the field, the historiography. Well, my students aren't overly concerned with any of that, but they were deeply compelled by the women in Vanguard and really pushed me to tell the stories well.
You are doing a masterful job at this interview, but it is now time for me to leave you with a set of impossible choices.
Oh, good.
You are allowed 3 books for the rest of your life that you can hold on to. Any 3 books, any genre. What are they?
First, it's Jesmyn Ward's Men We Read.
Ooh. Tell me why.
Changed me, caused me to reread my entire young life through the lens of the young men in my own life who are no longer here. It wrecked me, but in a way that will never leave me. So, yeah. I'd read anything by Jesmyn Ward. She's brilliant. But that book,
Absolutely.
Changed me.
And for those, it's a powerful memoir. It is, as you said, it changes you. it tears at you. It can haunt you. There's and of course, you being the historian, you know this, but the title itself comes from Harriet Tubman, right? Who talks about it was dead men that we reaped. Anyway, I get chills thinking about that book. That is a wonderful first book. What else?
Next, I'd mention Michelle Norris's memoir, The Grace of Silence. You're seeing a theme here, aren't you?
Yes.
Memoir.
Yes.
And the reason I mentioned Michelle's book is that she is the person who taught me that in order to do this work, you had to not only confess, you had to confront your own life, your own past, your own history, that if you told your own story, nobody could tell it for you or would be able to tell it for you. Nobody would assume it. That, public life is, as you well know better than I do, right? Full of slings and arrows, as they say. And Michelle said, so get out front. And she was trying to write a book about the history of race in America. Big topic, unwieldy and more. I think she's at work on that right now. But she said, first I have to write this memoir and I have to confront the secrets and the unspoken parts of my own past. And that has been, again, another inspiration. It's why in Vanguard, I start with my own family. Michelle really gave me, if you will, the courage to do that as honestly, as frankly as I could, and to leave folks to make what they would of it.
Wow, I actually have not read that, and I will make sure I add that to my list. I love a good memoir. I'm familiar with it, just hadn't read it. And the third book.
Wow, that's really, really hard.
Now, other than those two, every other book in human history.
I know. I've done.
You can pick one.
I've really done it now. So I sort of want to give you a funny answer because I'm not sure it's really the book I would take to my desert island, but I'll say that it's a work that shook me, and that is a theme for me and what I read. I like books that make me think, but also make me feel. And it's connected to family, and family is always running underneath my work. So when I was in graduate school, I read E. Franklin Frazier's The Black Bourgeoisie. I was on the M104 bus riding uptown, and I was shattered.
Did you feel implicated? Was it like a
he just called out all the people I loved. And it was, and I can remember I was on my way to the campus at Columbia where I was at school, and I went to my professor and I said, what on earth is this? And I appreciated my professors who did not make me read it, just let me find my way. But I have struggled, and my next book is a family history that looks at 6 or 7 generations of the women in my own family, looks at the history of slavery and sexual violence, and really tries to respond to Frazier, respond to Ta-Nehisi Coates and his notion of the dream, and a lot more, to talk about the ways in which in my family, enslavement and the sexual violence that the women in my family endured left us marked by the color of our skin, but marked in terms of how we see the world and how we negotiate it, how we think about family and culture and color and a lot more. But, Frazier really threw down the gauntlet and left me wondering if I had anything to say about the folks I come from. And now I think I actually might.
Oh, you absolutely do. And for those who don't know, again, Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier, the great sociologist, was written, I believe, in 1957. And it's a book that really does. And honestly, so the first book that I was ever gifted by my Uncle Bobby, who Uncle Bobby's bookstore is named after, was a first edition copy of E. Franklin Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie. It's a very special book to me.
Why did he gift you that?
He knew that it was, and I was a very young man, like teenager. 2 reasons. One, it was the most important book to him, and he thought that one day I'd be a scholar. I still thought I was going to be a basketball player, so clearly he had more insight than I did. But he also thought that book offered an analysis of the world that I was trying to enter, or that he thought that he feared I was trying to enter uncritically. And so he was like, you can do all this Jack and Jill stuff, which I ended up not doing. You can do, join all these organizations and these clubs, but understand like what's at stake here. I remember reading the part where in the book where Frazier talks about even how sort of Black people in America had so little access to capital and economic opportunity, that the few victories we had, we celebrated, you know? And I remember opening up Jet Magazine, which he also had stacks of, and seeing like the black guy who got the job, the black people who got married, the black person who got, a promotion, and thinking this was a big deal. Then I read Fraser and I was like, oh, maybe there's something more critical to be said about this. And I think he wanted me in his own way to arrive at that on my own, rather than him just shooting down my excitement at these things. He didn't want to destroy my investment in these middle-class spaces, but he wanted me to develop a critical disposition toward them on my own terms. And so I read the book then, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Then I read the book again in college, and I was like, oh, now I get it. And then I came and arrived at it later and said, oh, this book was ahead of its time. And it's only now that I fully appreciate how special a book that is. So yes, that's a wonderful, wonderful choice. So you will be on a desert island with 2 harrowing, haunting memoirs and a critical, devastating analysis of the Black bourgeoisie. I would have picked some fiction. I might have had some poems, maybe something. But everybody's got their own choices. No, those are great choices. And more importantly, this is Vanguard, again, is a wonderful book that really makes it a huge intervention. It helps us understand far more broadly and deeply the role that Black women played in America's freedom struggle. But it also gives us a much more complicated understanding of the journey that Black women had to take to get any semblance of freedom. And it gives us an insight about where we have to go moving forward in this moment. So thank you for this book. I'm sure it will be a bestseller. I encourage everyone to read it. And how can we find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter at Martha S. Jones _ and on Instagram at Martha S. Jones.
Thank you for your time and being so generous.
Well, thank you very much. It's really been an honor to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Coffee and Books. Make sure you follow us on Instagram with the handle Coffee and Books Show. Also, you can buy all the books that have been discussed here on bookshop.org/Uncle Bobby's, or you can go to UncleBobby's.com. That's UncleBobbies.com.